She had $61, that was it. $61, one suitcase, and a folding wooden ruler that nobody wanted. Her children had taken the house, the car, the accounts. 31 years of a life she had built with her own hands gone in a single afternoon, divided across a dining room table like it meant nothing. They left her the farm, a ruin nobody else would touch, $9,000 in back taxes, a barn with a rusted lock and a roof caving in. They thought they were leaving her with nothing. They were wrong. Because under that barn floor, under decades of concrete and silence, and a secret her father had carried to his grave, was something that would change everything. She just had to find it first. Eleanor Voss had one suitcase. That was it. One suitcase, a canvas tote with a broken zipper, and a folding wooden ruler that had belonged to her father. That was everything she owned on the morning of October 14th. Everything after 31 years of marriage. After 28 years of nursing shifts. After a life she had built with her own two hands and then watched get disassembled like furniture nobody wanted anymore. She was sitting on the front steps of the Salvation Army shelter on Mercer Street. It was 5:47 in the morning. She knew the exact time because she had been watching the clock on the bank building across the street since 4:30. Sleep had stopped coming around week 3. She had stopped fighting it around week 5. The air smelled like diesel and old coffee, and something faintly sweet she could never identify. She had her coat buttoned to the throat even though it was not that cold. Old habit. Keep yourself together. Keep yourself presentable. Keep yourself from becoming the kind of woman people look through. She held the ruler in both hands, not doing anything with it, just holding it. Her father, Walter Cobb, had carried that ruler every day of his working life. It was the collapsible kind, pale wood with brass fittings, the joints worn smooth from decades of use. He would unfold it slowly, deliberately, the way other men might light a cigarette. And before he measured anything, he would knock on it first. Whatever surface was in front of him, he would rap his knuckles against it and listen. She had asked him once why he did that. He said, "You listen before you measure, Eleanor. You find the hollow places first. That's where everything important is hiding." She had been 11 years old and had no idea what he meant. She was 60 now, and she was starting to understand. 4 months earlier, her husband Gerald had been alive. Technically. He had been breathing anyway, which at that point in his illness was what they had been measuring things by. Breathing. Eating small amounts. Recognizing her face when she came into the room. Those were the metrics of Gerald's last months, and Eleanor had tracked all of them with the same quiet precision she had used for 3 decades of patient care. Gerald Voss had been a good man. She believed that. She still believed it, even now, sitting on these steps with one suitcase and nowhere particular to be. He had been warm and steady and occasionally funny in a way that crept up on you. He had loved her, she was certain of that. He had also, in the last 14 months of his life, made a series of decisions that had left her with nothing. And the most painful part was that nobody had forced him. The funeral was on a Tuesday. 240 people came. Douglas gave the eulogy. He was good at it. Eleanor had to admit that. Her son had a way with rooms, a way of calibrating exactly what people wanted to hear, and then delivering it with just enough genuine emotion to make it feel unscripted. He was 44 years old and had been doing this his whole life, and Eleanor had spent most of those 44 years being proud of it. She stood by the casket and shook every hand. Her feet hurt. Her chest felt like something had been removed from it. She stood anyway, because that was what you did. 2 weeks after the funeral, Douglas called a family meeting. Those were the exact words he used, family meeting. Like they were going to discuss where to spend Thanksgiving. Like this was normal. Like Eleanor had not already noticed the careful way he had been watching her since Gerald got the diagnosis. The way he would take phone calls in the other room. The way he stopped showing her things on paper and started just summarizing them verbally. She drove to his house. The house she and Gerald had co-signed the mortgage on 15 years ago, back when Douglas's business was still finding its footing. She sat at his dining room table across from both her children. Douglas had a legal pad. Sandra had a folder. They had been busy. Sandra was 41 and had always been the quieter of the two. Softer, people said. Eleanor had always thought that was not quite the right word. Sandra was not soft. She was unfinished. She had spent her whole adult life deferring to Douglas on everything, and had never quite developed the habit of deciding things for herself. She sat there with her folder and her careful expression, and Eleanor thought, not for the first time, that her daughter looked like someone waiting to be told what to feel. Douglas cleared his throat. He explained things in the way he explained most things. Organized, methodical, a little too smooth, like he had rehearsed it. The house, he said, had been transferred to his name 18 months ago. Gerald had suggested it, he said. Estate planning. Very common. Douglas had the paperwork if she wanted to see it. Eleanor said she would like to see it. He slid it across the table. She read every word. Gerald's signature was on the bottom, dated 16 months before his death, which meant he had signed this 6 weeks after his diagnosis. The signature was his. She recognized every loop and slant of it. Gerald had not been tricked into signing this. Gerald had picked up a pen and written his name, and somewhere in his fear of what was coming, he had decided that Douglas handling things was the safest arrangement. She set the paper down. And the accounts? She asked. Sandra opened the folder. The joint savings account, the investment account, the retirement funds, Eleanor had contributed to for 3 decades of nursing shifts. All of it moved into a trust. Douglas and Sandra named as co-trustees. For estate management purposes, Sandra said. For her protection, Douglas said. The language was careful and correct and made Eleanor feel like she was reading her own obituary. And the car? Sandra's car now. Eleanor didn't drive much anymore, Douglas said. They would arrange transportation for her. There were services. Eleanor looked at her children. She studied their faces with the same quiet attention she had given to thousands of patients over 28 years. Douglas had Gerald's jaw and her own eyes, and the expression of a man who had convinced himself so completely that what he was doing was reasonable. Sandra was looking at the table. Is there anything left? Eleanor asked. There was one thing. Her father's farm, in Delwood, Tennessee. Walter Cobb had left it to Eleanor when he died 19 years ago, and it had been sitting there ever since, uninhabited. The property taxes had gone unpaid for several years. The county had sent letters. Douglas had not responded to the letters because, as he explained, the assessed value of the property was less than the back taxes owed, which meant it was effectively worthless. $9,400 in debt, a farmhouse that had been empty for 2 decades, and 80 acres of Tennessee land that hadn't been productive since the early 2000s. Sandra almost smiled when she mentioned it. Not cruelly, exactly. Just the way you smile at something that doesn't matter. I'll take it, Eleanor said. Douglas blinked. There's nothing there, Mom. The house is, you said, it's mine. My father left it to me. She looked at Douglas steadily. If it's worthless, you won't mind. Neither of them argued. Why would they? They had the house. They had the accounts. They had the car and the agency contacts and the life insurance payout that Gerald had apparently restructured 18 months ago as well. The farm was a liability, a punchline, something to let the old woman have so the conversation could end cleanly. Eleanor left Douglas's house that evening with her coat, her purse, her suitcase, and her father's folding ruler. She had not planned to take the ruler. It had been sitting on the shelf in Gerald's study, where she had placed it years ago when she was clearing out some of her father's things. She picked it up on her way out the door and put it in her bag without thinking about it. Or maybe she thought about it. She was not entirely sure. She stayed in Douglas's guest room for 3 weeks. She had nowhere else to go while she figured out what came next. Those 3 weeks had a texture she would not forget. Heather, Douglas's wife, sighed in the mornings when Eleanor was in the kitchen. Not loud sighs, polite ones. The sighs of a woman who was being inconvenienced and was too well-mannered to say so directly. Douglas would come home in the evenings and ask how she was doing in the tone of a man ticking a box. Each morning, the guest room nightstand had something new on it. A brochure for Sunrise Gardens Senior Living. A printout about Meadow Creek Assisted Living Community. Places with names designed to make you feel like you were going somewhere pleasant rather than somewhere final. Eleanor stacked them neatly in the nightstand drawer and said nothing. On the 22nd day, she packed her suitcase. She called a cab to the Greyhound station. She did not tell Douglas she was leaving. She wrote a note that said she would be in touch and left it on the kitchen counter, under a coffee mug so it wouldn't blow away. She sat in the cab and did not look back at the house. The shelter on Mercer Street had taken her in that first night, which was more than she had expected. They had a rule about length of stay, and Eleanor had hit the limit twice now. But the woman who ran the intake desk, whose name was Barb, and who had the tired eyes of someone who had seen everything, kept finding ways to extend it. Eleanor never asked her to. Barb just did it. 4 months. That was how long Eleanor had been navigating this. Shelter beds in church basements and the public library when the shelter was full. She had applied for 3 jobs and not heard back from any of them, which at 60, with a nursing license she had let lapse 2 years before Gerald's diagnosis, she had more or less expected. She had her Social Security coming eventually, but not yet. She had exactly nothing in the interim. Except the farm. She had not thought about it seriously until the 3rd month. She had thought about it the way you think about something impractical. The way you think about swimming when you are standing in the desert. And then one morning she woke up at 4:30 and could not go back to sleep, and she thought about it differently. She thought, where else are you going to go? She looked up Delwood, Tennessee on the library computer. It was small. 1 main street, a hardware store, a post office, a church. The kind of town that had stopped growing sometime in the 1970s and had simply stayed that way. The farm was 4 miles east of town on a county road. The county records showed the property was still in Eleanor Voss's name, which was her legal name, which meant Douglas had not bothered to do anything about it, because it was worthless, obviously. She bought a Greyhound ticket to Knoxville and then a connecting bus to a stop 12 miles outside Delwood. The total cost was $41. She had $61 left. She had a plan that extended roughly as far as getting off the bus, and after that she would figure it out. She was a nurse for 28 years. She had figured out things in much worse circumstances than this. The bus smelled like old upholstery and the particular loneliness of long-distance travel. She sat by the window and watched the landscape change. The city giving way to highway, the highway opening into hills. Tennessee in October was a kind of gold that hurt to look at directly. She watched it go by and tried not to think about the last time she had been to the farm, which was 7 years ago, which was before Walter died, which was when everything still made a kind of sense. A man on the bus offered her half his sandwich somewhere outside Cookville. She said no thank you. He nodded and ate it himself, and they did not speak again. She watched the hills until she fell asleep somewhere near the state line, and when she woke up the bus was pulling into a gas station on the edge of a small town, and a recorded voice announced the stop. She got off. She asked the gas station attendant for directions to the old Cobb farm on County Road 9. He was a young man, maybe 30, with a feed cap and a slow way of considering things. He scratched his chin. Walter Cobb's place? Hasn't been anybody out there in years. You family? I'm his daughter, Eleanor said. Huh. He gave her directions. She walked. It was 4 miles. She had her suitcase and her canvas tote and her father's ruler in her coat pocket. The road had no shoulder, and the occasional truck passed close enough that she stepped into the grass to let it by. The air smelled like wood smoke and something dead in the middle distance, and the clean, cold edge of a Tennessee morning. It took her nearly 2 hours. The farm was at the end of a gravel drive that had been almost swallowed by weeds. Saplings pushing up through the rocks. A rusted mailbox at the end, the flag broken off, the Cobb name barely readable under the rust. She stood at the mouth of the drive and looked at it. The farmhouse was a 2-story white structure, or it had been white once. The paint had peeled down to bare gray wood on most of the walls. The porch sagged on the left side where a support had rotted through. One of the upstairs windows was cracked. The gutters on the south side had come away from the house and were hanging by a single bracket. Behind the house, the barn, red once, now the color of old blood. The roof had caved in on the east end. A padlock hung on the main door. Even from here she could see it was rusted. This was it. This was what was left. She picked up her suitcase and walked up the drive. The front door was unlocked. It had never had a proper lock, just a latch, and the latch had warped. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The smell hit her first. Dust and something stale and the particular closed-in smell of a house that had been waiting. She stood in the front hall and let her eyes adjust. Her father's chair was in the living room. Leather, or what had been leather, positioned by the window that looked out at the barn. The upholstery had cracked and faded. She stood in the doorway and looked at it for a long time. She found the fuse box in the kitchen pantry and tried the main breaker. Nothing. She tried the kitchen faucet. A groan of pipes. Then silence, then a thin trickle of rust-colored water that ran for a minute and stopped. She sat on the edge of her father's chair. The last light of the afternoon came through the window and landed on the floorboards in a long rectangle. She had $61, no electricity, no water, no heat, no plan beyond this room. She was not scared, she was something else. Something she did not have a word for yet. Something that felt, strangely, more like herself than she had felt in 4 months of shelter beds and borrowed grace. She held the ruler in her lap and looked out at the barn. That first night she slept on the bare mattress in her father's bedroom, covered by a quilt she found in the closet that her mother had made sometime before Eleanor was born. The stitching was coming apart in places. She pulled it up to her chin and lay in the dark and listened to the sounds a quiet house makes when no one has been in it for years. The settle and creak of old wood. Something small moving in the walls. Wind in the eaves. She did not sleep for a long time. When she did sleep, she did not dream. She woke before dawn and got up and started cleaning. That was day 1. She found brooms in the kitchen closet, both of them ancient but intact. She swept every floor. She used rags she tore from an old sheet to wipe down surfaces. She scraped the worst of the mold from the bathroom tiles with a butter knife she found in a kitchen drawer. She carried armloads of accumulated debris out through the back door and piled it near the tree line. She worked until dark. Day 2, a neighbor appeared. She heard a truck slow on the road and looked up from the burn pile, where she was feeding broken fence boards to a cautious fire. A man was leaning out the driver's window. Maybe 65. Heavy canvas jacket. Hands that had worked for a living for a long time. "You living out here?" he called. "I am," she said. He pulled into the drive. Got out slowly, the way men with bad knees do. He looked around at the property, at her burn pile, at the suitcase still sitting on the porch because she hadn't figured out where to put it yet. "Water's been shut off," he said. "Need to call the county to get it reinstated. Electric too. There's deposits. How much? Couple hundred, probably. For both." She nodded. She had $61. 200 was not a number she had access to. He did not say anything for a moment. He just looked at the farmhouse with the expression of a man doing arithmetic. "I'm Hank Briley," he said. "Got a place about 1.5 miles east of here. Knew your father some. He was a decent man." "Eleanor Voss," she said. "He was." Hank looked at the suitcase on the porch. He looked at the burn pile. He looked at Eleanor. He had the face of a man who had watched people get into difficulty long enough to recognize it without needing it explained. "Coffee at my place if you want it," he said. "I got a phone you can use to call the county. I'd appreciate that," she said. He drove her to his house. She made the calls. He did not ask her any questions she did not want to answer, and there were many she did not want to answer, and he somehow seemed to understand this without being told. The next morning, she found an envelope in the mailbox at the end of the drive. No return address. No name on the front. Inside was $260 in 20s, and a note written in shaky handwriting on a piece of lined paper torn from a notebook. "Walter was a good neighbor. Welcome home." Eleanor stood at the mailbox for a long time holding the money and the note. She did not know who had sent it. She did not ask. She called the county from Hank's phone that afternoon and arranged for the water and electricity to be reinstated. Deposits paid. Service restored within 48 hours. She was back. Within the first week the house was livable. Not comfortable. Not warm. But livable. The water ran brown for the first 20 minutes after it came on, then cleared to something she would drink. The electricity worked everywhere except the upstairs hallway. She bought canned goods and a bag of rice at the hardware store in Delwood, which also sold a small selection of groceries in the back. She cooked on the old gas stove, which lit on the 3rd try with a match, and ate at the kitchen table looking out the window at the barn. Always at the barn. Her father had never let her in, not once her entire childhood. The house was open, the fields were hers to wander, the woods at the back of the property were fair game. But the barn had a padlock on it from her earliest memory, and Walter had never offered an explanation beyond "that's my workshop," and the specific tone of voice that meant the subject was closed. When she was 12, she had tried to peek through a gap in the siding. Walter had come up behind her so quietly she had not heard him, and he raised his voice. Just once. Just that once in her entire childhood. She never tried again. Now she was 60 years old, and Walter was 19 years gone, and the barn sat at the back of the property with its rusted lock and its caved-in roof, like a question that had been sitting on the table so long everyone had forgotten it was still there. The morning of her 11th day at the farm, Eleanor woke up with the particular clarity that sometimes comes before dawn. She lay still for a moment. Then she got up, put on her coat, picked up her father's ruler from the bedside table where she had been leaving it, and walked out to the barn. The padlock was rusted, but the hasp was screwed into wood that had been softening for 20 years. She found a claw hammer in the shed behind the house and wedged it behind the hasp plate and pulled. The wood held for a moment. Then it didn't. The lock clattered to the ground. She pulled the barn door open. Morning light fell across the interior, and she stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. The collapsed east end was a tangle of fallen beams and old hay, 20 years of debris layered into something that looked archaeological. Tools hung on the walls, their outlines still recognizable even under the rust. A workbench ran along the far wall, its surface buried under fallen insulation and animal nests and the accumulated dust of 2 decades. She stepped inside carefully, testing the floor before she committed to it. The floor was solid, more than solid. She looked down and pushed hay aside with her boot and saw it. Concrete, smooth, poured concrete, flat and even, extending wall to wall across the entire barn floor. She crouched and pressed her palm to it. There was nothing rough about it. This was not someone pouring a quick utility slab. This was deliberate work, careful work. Barns did not have floors like this. Not the barns of 1950s rural Tennessee. They had dirt or packed earth or sometimes planks. Not poured concrete done this cleanly, unless someone had a reason to cover something. Eleanor stood up and walked the floor slowly, pushing hay aside as she went. The concrete was consistent across most of the space, but near the northeast corner she stopped. The surface changed slightly, smother, and when she stood on it, when she shifted her weight to the balls of her feet, the way Walter had taught her to feel a floor, the sound was different. She knew that sound. She reached into her coat pocket and took out her father's ruler. She held it the way he used to hold it, horizontal, and she rapped her knuckles against the concrete floor, the way he had always rapped his knuckles against walls before he measured them. Find the hollow places first. That's where everything important is hiding. The knock went down and came back different. Empty, deep, like she had knocked on a door instead of a floor. Eleanor crouched down and pressed her ear to the concrete the way a doctor presses a stethoscope to a chest. She knocked again. There was a room under there. She sat back on her heels and stared at the floor. Her heart was doing something she needed it to stop doing so she could think clearly. She pressed both hands flat on the concrete and breathed. Walter had put something under this barn. He had sealed it under a concrete floor and locked the barn door, and never said a word about it to anyone in his life. And then he had put a 4-digit combination on the back of his folding ruler and pressed it into his daughter's hands while he was dying and said she would know when she needed it. She turned the ruler over in her hands. The numbers were there on the back, scratched into the wood with something sharp. She had always assumed they were a date or a measurement reference, the kind of marking tradesmen make on tools. She had never looked closely at them as a combination. She looked now. 4 numbers. She was going to need help. She could not break through concrete alone. She put the ruler back in her pocket and walked out of the barn. Hank was in his shop when she drove to his place in the borrowed truck she had arranged with the hardware store owner for small errands. She had not told Hank why she was coming. She found him replacing the bearing on an old bench grinder. He looked up when she came in. She told him about the concrete, about the hollow sound, about the way the floor was wrong. He listened without interrupting, which was something she had come to appreciate about him. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've got a pneumatic jackhammer in the back. Runs off the compressor. You want to take a look?" "I do," she said. "All right," he said, and he went to get it. They drove out together the next morning. Eleanor made coffee first, in the old percolator she had found in the back of a kitchen cabinet. They sat on the porch with the coffee and looked out at the fields. The October air was cool and smelled like turned earth and wood smoke from somewhere down the road. A hawk was circling over the far tree line, patient and unhurried. "I used to help your dad sometimes," Hank said. "Odd jobs. He'd need a second pair of hands for something and he'd come by. Quiet man." "He was," Eleanor said, "but not unfriendly, just quiet. He talked when he had something to say. He just didn't have something to say very often." Hank looked at his coffee. That's a good way to be. They went into the barn. He walked the floor the way she had, tested different spots, crouched at the northeast corner and knocked and went still, listening. Different over here, he said. Yes. He looked up at her, not asking a question exactly, just giving her a moment. Let's open it, she said. He set up the compressor outside the barn door and ran the hose in. The jackhammer noise was tremendous in the enclosed space. Eleanor stepped back and covered her ears and watched Hank work. He was methodical about it, starting at one edge of the area she had identified, working the chisel point in, breaking away in sections rather than just hammering randomly. Chunks of concrete tumbled away. Dust rose. She tied a bandana around her face. 40 minutes in, the chisel hit something different. A metallic ring, sharp and clear, cut through the machine noise. Hank pulled the trigger and the jackhammer went silent. The silence in its wake felt enormous. He crouched and used his hands to sweep away the broken concrete. Eleanor came close. Steel. Dull gray steel, revealed in a rough circle where the concrete had come away. Hank kept clearing. The outline became clear. A hatch, roughly 4 feet square. Steel plate set into a steel frame bolted to a concrete foundation beneath the barn floor. On the near side, a combination lock. Heavy duty. The kind that had not moved in a long time. Hank sat back on his heels and looked at it. Your father put this here, he said. It was not a question. Yes, Eleanor said. That is not a simple installation. No. She pulled her father's ruler from her coat pocket. She held it and looked at the 4 numbers on the back. She had carried this thing for 19 years. She had thought about those numbers as dates, as measurements, as the arbitrary markings old craftsmen put on tools. She had never once thought about them as a combination, because she had not known there was a lock. She crouched beside the hatch. Her hands were steady. She was surprised by that. She dialed the first number. Left. Second number right. Third number left. Fourth number right. The lock clicked open. She stayed crouched over it for a moment, not moving. He gave this to me when he was dying, she said. He said I'd know when I needed it. Hank did not say anything. She reached for the hatch. It was heavy. She and Hank lifted it together and it swung back on thick hinges that had not been used in a very long time, and cold air came up from below. Dense and cool and holding a smell she did not recognize. Not bad, just old. Chemical at the edges. Sweet underneath. Below them, a steel ladder descending into dark. Eleanor looked at Hank. He said, I'll go first. She said no, and she took the flashlight he offered her and gripped the top rung of the ladder and started down, 8 rungs. About 10 feet. Her feet found the concrete floor and she turned on the flashlight and swept it across the dark. She stopped breathing. The space was as large as the barn above. Same footprint dug into the Tennessee clay and lined with concrete. Steel beams in the ceiling. And the air, which was cool and even and held by some ventilation system, she could hear faintly humming in the walls. And the shelves. Floor-to-ceiling wooden shelving units, built with care, running the length of every wall and in rows across the middle of the space. Thousands of bottles. Glass bottles, sealed with dark wax, each one bearing a handwritten paper label. Eleanor walked toward the nearest shelf on unsteady legs and reached out and took a bottle down. She held it up to the flashlight. The glass was thick and the wax seal was intact, and through the glass the liquid was the color of dark amber, perfectly clear. She looked at the label. Cobb Reserve. 1954. Barrel 4, bottle 17. Whiskey. Her father had been making whiskey. Hank came down the ladder behind her. His flashlight joined hers, and they stood in the middle of the space and looked at what Walter Cobb had built under his barn, and then sealed, and then walked away from without a word to anyone. How many? Hank said. Eleanor was walking the shelves. The bottles were organized by year. 1952, 1953, 1954. The years ran along the shelves in sequence, each year in its own section, labeled and arranged with the precision of a man who took his work seriously. The last year was 1969. Thousands, she said. Maybe 5,000, maybe more. Hank came to stand beside her. His flashlight moved over the shelves slowly. Eleanor, he said. I know, she said. Near the base of the ladder there was a workbench. Cleaner than everything else. Tools on the pegboard above it precisely hung. A set of glass instruments she did not recognize. And in the center of the workbench, weighted down by a single sealed bottle, An envelope. Her name on the front. Walter Cobb's handwriting. She picked it up. The paper was yellowed but intact. The wax seal on the back was pressed with what looked like a coin. She broke it with her thumb and pulled out the letter. Hank turned off his flashlight. He stood in the dark and gave her whatever privacy a room buried 10 feet underground could offer. Eleanor read. She stood at the workbench with her father's flashlight and her father's words on paper that had been waiting in this room for the day she came looking. And she read every word, slowly twice. The smell of old whiskey and damp concrete around her. The faint hum of the ventilation system her father had built with his own hands and wired into the farm's electrical system so carefully that it had kept running for decades without anyone noticing. Her father had been 23 years old in 1949. The farm was 60 acres of land that would not produce enough to live on. Her mother had been pregnant. He had learned to make whiskey from his own father, who had learned it from his. It was illegal. He knew that. He started because he had no other way to feed his family. He was good at it. Better than good. Men came from long distances to buy what he made. He charged well and they paid it. For 3 years he saved everything he earned. By 1952, he had enough to dig the vault and build the shelves. The first bottles went in that same year. He dug it himself every shovelful, over 2 years. He poured the concrete. He built the shelves. He created a system for aging and storing that was careful and exact and reflected everything he knew about wood and air and patience. He made whiskey until 1969. 17 years. Everything he produced went into the vault. He did not sell from the vault. The vault was his insurance, his protection against whatever might come. What came was a man named Earl Danton, business partner, distributor, someone Walter had trusted. Danton wanted more of the money. When Walter refused, Danton threatened to go to the county sheriff. When that did not move Walter, Danton came to the farm one night in October of 1969 with 2 other men. Walter did not write what happened next. He wrote only that he did what he had to do to protect his family, that he would not put the details on paper, that Danton left and did not come back, that Walter shut everything down the following morning, sealed the vault, poured the fresh concrete over the hatch, locked the barn door, and lived quietly for the rest of his life, believing he had done something unforgivable. Eleanor lowered the letter. The flashlight made a circle on the workbench floor. She stood in it and breathed. The last paragraph, I left this for you because you are the only one I trust to know what to do with it. Not because you are perfect, not because you will not make mistakes, but because you are the one who always did the right thing even when nobody was watching. That is a rarer quality than you know. The bottles are worth money, real money, more than the house, more than anything your husband left behind. But the money is not the point, Eleanor. The point is that this land is yours. Nobody gave it to you. I built it for you. I want you to use it like you built it yourself, your father, Walter. Eleanor folded the letter. She stood in the dark for a moment. Then she looked over at where Hank was standing, invisible in the dark, patient as a post. Hank, she said. Yeah, he said. I'm going to need your help with something, I figured, he said. She climbed the ladder first. The October air hit her face, and she stood in the ruined barn with concrete dust on her coat and her father's letter in her pocket and the weight of something enormous and quiet settling into her chest. Not grief, not fear. Something that felt, for the first time in a very long time, like ground under her feet. They covered the hatch with plywood and hay before they climbed out. Hank did not ask why. He just helped her drag the boards over, spread the old hay back across the surface until the floor looked like it had looked before, like nothing had been disturbed, like the barn was just a barn. Eleanor stood in the doorway and looked at it one more time. Nobody knows about this, she said. I came out to help you clear some debris, Hank said. That's all I did. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the steady expression of a man who understood that some things did not need elaborating. She pulled the barn door shut behind them. That evening she sat at the kitchen table with her father's letter spread flat in front of her and thought about what she actually knew. Which was this: Walter Cobb had spent 17 years making whiskey in a vault under his barn. He had stored all of it. He had sealed it in 1969. The bottles were organized by year from 1952 to 1969. There were thousands of them. The seals were intact. The storage conditions had been controlled and consistent for over 50 years. She knew almost nothing about whiskey. She had drunk it maybe a dozen times in her life and had not particularly liked it. She knew nothing about what aged spirits were worth, or how they were sold, or who bought them, or any of the market mechanics involved in converting 5,000 bottles of 50-year-old whiskey into something usable. But she had been a nurse for 28 years, and nursing had taught her one thing above everything else. When you encountered something you did not understand, you did not guess, you went and found out. She drove to the Delwood Library the next morning. It was a single room above the post office, with 8 computer terminals and shelves that smelled like the particular combination of old paper and good intention. The librarian was a woman in her late 60s named Frances, who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain, and who, when Eleanor explained what she was looking for, simply pointed at a terminal and said, "Take your time." Eleanor took 4 hours. She read everything she could find about aged American whiskey, about the bourbon market, about pre-prohibition spirits and vintage bottles and what collectors paid for rare and properly stored examples. She read auction records. She found an article from a spirits magazine about a single bottle of 1940s Tennessee sour mash that had sold for $87,000 at a private auction. She sat with that number for a moment and then went back and read the article again more carefully to make sure she had not misread it. She had not misread it. She found a directory of spirits appraisers. There were 3 within reasonable driving distance of Delwood. She wrote down their names and numbers on a piece of paper Frances gave her without being asked. She drove back to the farm. She sat on the porch with the list and the folding ruler in her coat pocket, and she thought about who she was going to call and what she was going to say and how much she was going to tell them. She called the second name on the list, a man named Dennis Pratt who operated out of Knoxville, and whose website described him as a certified spirits appraiser and authentication specialist with 30 years in the industry. His assistant answered, and Eleanor explained what she had. Not in detail, enough detail. There was a pause on the line that told her more than anything the assistant said next. Mr. Pratt could be there Thursday. He arrived in a clean silver sedan at 9:15 Thursday morning, wearing a sport coat and carrying a leather case with brass fittings. He was maybe 60, gray at the temples, the precise manner of a man who spent his professional life being careful. Eleanor met him at the drive. Hank was there too, leaning against his truck with a thermos of coffee. She had asked him to stay. She did not entirely know why. It just seemed like the kind of morning where you wanted someone nearby who had no particular interest in the outcome. She led Dennis Pratt into the barn. She had moved the plywood back herself that morning. She uncovered the hatch and opened it and descended the ladder first and turned on the lights she had rigged from an extension cord. And she watched his face as his feet hit the floor, and he turned and saw the shelves. He stopped. He stood at the base of the ladder and did not move for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, "Good Lord." He walked the shelves slowly. He pulled bottles at random. He held each one up to the light. He examined the wax seals with a magnifying glass from his case. He tested the labels. He used a small instrument Eleanor did not recognize to measure something about the glass. He took notes on a clipboard and did not speak while he worked. Eleanor sat on the stool at the workbench and waited. 28 years of nursing had made her very good at waiting. She had sat in rooms with people who were getting news they were not ready for, and she had learned to be still in a way that did not fill the silence with herself. She did the same now. She sat and was still and let Dennis Pratt do his work. He was down there for nearly an hour. When he finally came back to the workbench and sat in the second chair she had placed there, he looked like a man who had just done something that adjusted his idea of what was possible. "Who made this?" he asked. "My father," Eleanor said. "Your father." He looked at his clipboard. What did he do for a living? He was a farmer, Eleanor said. Officially. Pratt looked at the shelves, then back at Eleanor. "The aging technique here is extraordinary. The barrel char on the 1950s bottlings alone is something I have not encountered outside of museum quality collections. The storage conditions are as good as anything I have seen in a commercial facility. Better than some." He paused. "How long has it been sealed?" "Since 1969, Eleanor said. He was quiet for a moment. "I cannot give you a precise valuation today," he said. "Full authentication requires chemical analysis, lab testing, provenance documentation, and that takes time. He looked at the shelves again. But based on volume, condition, age, and what I can assess on site, I can give you a preliminary range. Please, Eleanor said. He set his clipboard on his knee. He was the kind of man who did not rush to numbers. He respected them too much for that. Between $18 and $30 million, he said. Possibly more, depending on authentication results and how the collection is released to market. The number sat in the air between them. Eleanor did not move. $18 to $30 million. In bottles of whiskey. Under a barn. On a farm her children had laughed about. If I needed to liquidate a portion quickly, she said. A small private sale. Pre-authentication based on my preliminary assessment and my name behind it. He thought for a moment. 100 bottles from the oldest section. The 1952 and 1953 vintages. I have 3 collectors who would buy them within the week. You would see somewhere between $350,000 and $450,000. Cash equivalent, wired transfer. Eleanor looked at the shelves. At the 1952 section. At the bottles her father had made when she was 2 years old. When he was just a young man trying to figure out how to feed his family on 60 acres of Tennessee clay. Do it, she said. She took 10 bottles from the 1952 section, with Pratt that afternoon for lab testing, wrapped in the cloth padding he pulled from his case. He shook her hand at the driveway. She watched his silver sedan go down the road and disappear around the bend. Then she walked back to the barn and sat in the doorway in the thin November sun and tried to breathe. Hank came and sat beside her. He had not asked about the meeting or what had been said. He just came and sat with his thermos and poured her a cup without asking if she wanted one. She took it. Well, he said. Well, she said. He looked out at the property, at the broken fence line along the east field, at the tree line beyond. Your father was something else, he said finally. I spent my whole childhood thinking he was just a quiet man who liked his barn more than his family, she said. Turns out he was building something the entire time. He just couldn't tell me what it was. Hank was quiet. Then what's next? I pay the taxes, she said. I fix this house. And I keep my mouth shut. The first part of that was straightforward. Owen Fitch's office was up a narrow staircase above the post office, and Eleanor went to see him the following Monday with her father's letter and the trust documents she had already reviewed once, and wanted to review again with someone who could tell her she was understanding them correctly. Owen Fitch was 59. Brown hair going gray, the kind of office where the stacks of folders were organized by a system only he understood, a coffee mug on his desk that said "World's Okayest Lawyer" in faded letters. His father had been Walter Cobb's attorney. Owen had taken over the practice when his father retired and had inherited, among other things, a locked filing cabinet of old client documents he had never had occasion to open. He opened it now. The trust documents were there, 30 pages. Eleanor read while Owen made notes on a legal pad. The irrevocable trust Walter Cobb had established in 1989 was, Owen explained, about as airtight as estate planning got. The farm, the land, all structures, all contents, including any personal property left by the grantor within the trust boundaries. All of it belonged solely to Eleanor. Not Gerald, not Douglas, not Sandra Eleanor. The trust predated her marriage by 8 years. It was separate property. No one had any claim to it. What about the contents of the property? Eleanor asked. If there's something of value on the land. Something my father left. The trust language is explicit. Owen ran his finger down the page. All property, real and personal, within the boundaries of the trust parcel belongs to the beneficiary. Your father was thorough. Whatever's on that land is yours. Eleanor nodded. She paid his consultation fee in cash from the envelope Pratt had given her as an advance against the private sale. She shook Owen's hand and went back to the farm. She used the rest of the advance to pay the county $9,400 in back property taxes. She sat in the county assessor's office and handed over a cashier's check, and the woman behind the desk stamped the account paid in full, and Eleanor felt something release in her chest that had been tight since she first read the number in the library. Then she opened a bank account at the small regional bank on Delwood's Main Street. The woman who opened the account did not ask many questions. Eleanor deposited $6,000, which was what remained of the advance after taxes. It was more money than she had controlled in 4 months. She went to the hardware store and bought paint. White exterior, 2 gallons to start. She went to the lumber yard at the edge of town and ordered the materials she needed to shore up the porch. Hank helped her unload the truck when she got back. He looked at the paint cans without comment. South wall first, he said. It gets the most weather. South wall first, she agreed. They worked on the house for 2 weeks. The porch got new support beams. The exterior got 2 coats of paint on 3 sides, the 4th side waiting on another can. The cracked upstairs window got replaced by a pane Hank cut himself in his shop. The kitchen got rewired by a man Hank knew who came out one Tuesday and did the work in a day and charged Eleanor a reasonable amount, and did not ask any unnecessary questions. The barn Eleanor left exactly as it was. She had a proper lock installed on the door. The combination she chose was not the same as the 4 numbers on her father's ruler. She bought a truck, used 10 years old, rust on the passenger door, solid engine. The dealer in town was a man named Gary, who had known Walter slightly, and who gave Eleanor what she suspected was a better price than he would have given a stranger. She did not ask about it. She paid, shook his hand, and drove the truck home. The farm was starting to look like someone lived there. She had been in Delwood for 5 weeks when Dot Greer said more than 4 words to her for the first time. Dot ran the tack and grocery on the main street, which was the only place in town that sold both fence staples and tomato paste, and had a small postal counter in the back. She was 70, white-haired, with the particular economy of movement of a woman who had been doing the same job in the same place for decades and had eliminated every unnecessary motion. She had been leaving a coffee ready for Eleanor each morning since the 3rd day, without ever saying she was going to do it. Eleanor had been paying for it without ever commenting on the gesture. On the 34th day, Dot put the coffee on the counter, and then stayed behind the counter and looked at Eleanor. "You're Walter Cobb's girl," she said. "I am," Eleanor said. "You look like him around the eyes." "People have said that." Dot studied her, not unkindly. "The way you study someone when you are deciding whether they are the person you thought they were." "He was a good neighbor," Dot said. "Quiet, but good." "Yes," Eleanor said. Dot went back to sorting the morning mail delivery. Eleanor took her coffee and drove home, but she thought about that conversation for the rest of the day. The way Dot had looked at her before deciding to say anything. The way she had mentioned Walter by name as though the name meant something she was not ready to explain yet. The private sale went through in the 3rd week of November. Pratt handled everything. 3 collectors, all vetted, all under confidentiality agreements. 105 bottles from the 1952 and 1953 vintages. The final total was $420,000, wired to Eleanor's account in 2 installments. She paid the remaining property taxes for the next 3 years in advance. She put $50,000 into a repair fund. She kept the rest liquid, every transaction documented, every dollar traceable. She had spent 28 years keeping charts on patients, and she applied the same precision to this, because she already understood, without quite being able to articulate why, that at some point someone was going to ask her to account for every dollar, and she was going to be ready. It was early December when Sandra drove down. Eleanor saw the rental car from the kitchen window. Silver sedan, Tennessee plates pulling slowly up the graveled drive. She recognized the way Sandra parked, always slightly crooked, always leaving more room than necessary. Eleanor dried her hands on the dish towel and went to the front door and opened it before Sandra could knock. Her daughter stood at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at the house. She was wearing a good coat, city-clothed, the kind that were appropriate for almost any occasion, without being quite right for any particular one. She looked at the new porch boards, at the painted walls, at the truck parked beside the house. "You painted it," she said. 3 sides, Eleanor said. 4th one next week. Sandra came up the steps. She stood close and looked at her mother with the expression Eleanor had seen on patients who were trying to assess something without letting on that they were worried. "Mom." She stopped. Started again. "Where did the money come from?" "I managed," Eleanor said. "You had $61 when you left. I had more options than that." Sandra looked at the truck, at the new porch railing. She was doing arithmetic in her head. Eleanor could see it. "Mom, this isn't safe. You're out here by yourself." "If something happened, I've been here 5 weeks, Eleanor said. "I paid the back taxes. I fixed the porch. I bought a truck. I rewired the kitchen. I've been fine." "That's not." Sandra stopped. "Douglas is worried." Douglas hasn't called me once. The silence between them was not comfortable. It was not hostile either. It was the silence of two people who had things to say to each other that neither of them was ready to say yet. Sandra's eyes moved to the barn.
What's in there?
Tools, Eleanor said. Old hay. Dad always said Grandpa Walter's barn was locked.
It was. I opened it, and?
Just a barn, Eleanor said. Sandra looked at her. Eleanor looked back. 28 years of nursing had also made her very good at keeping her face still when it needed to be. Sandra left after 2 hours. She had accepted coffee and declined lunch and asked 11 more questions about the money that Eleanor did not answer. She hugged Eleanor at the car, briefly, and drove back down the road. Eleanor stood on the porch and watched until the car was gone. Then she went inside and called Hank. She came. I figured, he said. She saw the truck, the paint. She'll tell Douglas. What do you think he'll do? Eleanor knew her son. She had known him for 44 years. She knew how his mind worked when he felt like something was happening, that he should be controlling. He'll look at the property records first, she said. Then he'll call the bank. Then he'll call a lawyer, and then he'll do what Douglas always does when he's scared of something. She did not say what that was. Hank did not ask. He already understood. She was right about the order. Douglas pulled the county assessor records within a week. He found the trust documents. He found the paid tax receipts. He called the bank and they told him nothing. He called Owen Fitch's office, and Owen told him he couldn't discuss client matters. Eleanor knew all of this because she had told Owen she wanted to know if Douglas called, and Owen had told her, and then Owen had said he wanted to talk to her about something else. She went to his office on a Thursday afternoon. Owen was sitting behind his desk with a folder open in front of him, and the world's okayest lawyer mug pushed to one side. He looked like a man who had been thinking about how to say something carefully. Douglas called twice, Owen said. The second time he had an attorney on the line. I expected that, Eleanor said. They're putting together a conservatorship petition, Owen said. Douglas is going to argue that you've been making financial decisions that suggest compromised judgment, the sudden relocation, the unexplained income. He's hired a psychiatrist who has agreed to submit a written evaluation of your mental capacity based on a remote consultation with Douglas. He paused. Which means the psychiatrist has never met you. Eleanor sat with that for a moment. They haven't filed yet, Owen said. But they will, probably within the next 2 weeks, and if they do, there will be a hearing. You'll need to appear. The burden of proof is on them, but a judge has to take it seriously and give it a hearing, regardless of the quality of the evidence. He looked at her. Eleanor, I need to know what you found on that property. Not the general picture. Everything. Because if Douglas has any way to make this look like you're concealing a criminal asset, he'll use it. She had known this moment was coming. She had been moving toward it since the day she opened the letter. She had just not been ready to sit down in front of another person and say it out loud. She told him everything. The vault, the bottles, Walter's letter, the 1969 incident with Earl Danton, the private sale through Pratt, the $420,000, the trust language and what it covered. Owen listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at the ceiling for a long time in the way of a man running calculations. The trust is airtight, he said finally. Nothing Douglas does will touch the property or the contents. The land is yours regardless of what happens in court. But the personal assets, the bank account, the proceeds from sales, those are potentially vulnerable if a court declares you incompetent and appoints Douglas as conservator. He leaned forward. Which means we need to make sure they don't. What do we need? Eleanor said. Your medical records. A cognitive evaluation from your own doctor. A complete accounting of every financial decision you've made since arriving here. Every receipt. Every transaction. Every dollar in and out. He paused. And we need to address the 1969 issue directly. Because if Douglas has even a partial copy of your father's letter, he's going to use it. Eleanor thought about that. She thought about Walter, who had spent the last 30 years of his life carrying the weight of a night in 1969 that he believed made him something he was not, who had built a vault and sealed it and tried to be a good man in the space that was left, who had pressed a folding ruler into his daughter's hands while he was dying and trusted her to figure out the rest. I need to know what actually happened to Earl Danton, she said. Owen looked at her. Before the hearing, she said, I need to know. That was 1969, Owen said carefully. 55 years ago. I know, she said. She went to see Dot Greer the next morning. Not at the store. She drove to Dot's house, which was a white frame house behind a careful garden 3 blocks off the main street. She knocked. Dot opened the door, looked at Eleanor, and stepped back to let her in without asking why she had come. The kitchen smelled like coffee and something baking. Dot poured 2 cups and sat down and looked at Eleanor across the table with the expression of a woman who had been waiting for this conversation for some time. Eleanor said, "Earl Danton." Dot's hands wrapped around her coffee mug. She was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone who didn't know. The quiet of someone deciding. "He came into the store," Dot said. "October of 1969. Bought a bus ticket from me. I was selling them then, before the post office took over the contract. He had a suitcase. The big kind. The kind you take when you're not planning on coming back." She paused. He was scared. I could see that. Men who are scared move differently than men who are in a hurry. He was scared. Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest. "Where was the ticket to?" she said. "Charlotte," Dot said. "He had a connection going further west." "He didn't say where. Did he say anything?" Dot thought about it. "He said he needed to be somewhere else for a while. That's all. He paid cash. He left on the 10 o'clock bus." Eleanor looked at her coffee. "You never told anyone," Eleanor said. "It was not quite a question. Nobody asked," Dot said. "Walter never said a word about it. The sheriff never came around asking. After a while it just became one of those things that happened and then didn't happen." She looked at Eleanor. "Your father was not a violent man. Whatever happened between them, Earl Danton left at his own 2 feet with a suitcase and a bus ticket." Eleanor sat in Dot's kitchen for another 20 minutes. She did not say much. She did not need to. She drove back to the farm and sat at the kitchen table with her father's letter and read it one more time, knowing now what she had not known before. Walter had spent 3 decades believing he had done something unforgivable. He had sealed his life's work under concrete and lived small and careful and burdened because of a night that ended with a frightened man buying a bus ticket to Charlotte. He had never known. She folded the letter and placed it exactly in the center of the table. Then she called Owen and told him what Dot had told her. Owen listened and then was quiet for a long moment and then said, "I'm going to want Dot's written statement before the hearing." "She'll give it," Eleanor said. She was almost certain of that. The petition arrived on a Wednesday, delivered by a process server who drove up the drive, handed her an envelope without meeting her eyes, and drove away. Eleanor stood on the porch and opened it. Douglas had filed for conservatorship of her person and estate. The petition cited her age, her sudden relocation to an isolated rural property, her apparent confusion regarding her financial situation, and her vulnerability to exploitation by unknown third parties, who may have influenced her financial decision-making. Attached was a written psychiatric evaluation, prepared by a Dr. Carol Winship, who stated, based on collateral information provided by family members, that Eleanor Voss displayed signs consistent with adjustment disorder following bereavement and may have reduced capacity for sound financial judgment. Dr. Carol Winship had never met Eleanor Voss. She read the petition twice, slowly, from the first page to the last. Then she folded it, put it in the box she had been keeping her documents in, and went inside to make supper. Beans and rice, the same as the first week. She ate at the kitchen table and looked out at the barn and thought about her father, who had been afraid his whole life that someone would come and take what he had built, who had sealed it under concrete and never let anyone close, and who had, in the end, been wrong about who the danger was. He had thought it was Earl Danton. It was not Earl Danton. It was the ordinary fear that lives in families when money appears and people start deciding what they deserve. She washed her bowl and dried it and put it away. Then she went to the kitchen table and began organizing her documents. Every receipt, every transaction, the paid tax certificates, the bank statements, the truck purchase, the repair invoices, the first sale through Pratt with his preliminary assessment attached, the irrevocable trust documents in their entirety, Owen's consultation notes, and a timeline, which she typed on the library computer and printed, listing every decision she had made since October 14th in chronological order with the supporting documentation behind each entry. She worked until midnight. When she put everything in the box and put the box on the kitchen table and stood back and looked at it. A woman who did not know what she was doing did not have a box like that. She picked up her father's ruler and turned it in her hands. The 4 numbers on the back caught the kitchen light. She had been carrying this thing since she was 41 years old, through a marriage and a career and a grief and a season of sleeping in shelter beds, and it had been a combination the entire time, and she had not known it. But she had held on to it anyway, because Walter had given it to her and said she would know when she needed it, and she had believed him even when she didn't understand. She put it in the box with everything else. Then she called Hank. It was late. He answered on the second ring, which told her he had been awake. They filed, she said. I know, he said. Owen called me. I need to be ready in 3 weeks, she said. You're ready now, he said. She looked at the box on the table, at everything inside it, at the life she had been building since October, one repair and one receipt and one careful decision at a time. Maybe, she said. Eleanor, he said. You paid $9,000 in back taxes inside of your first week here. You rewired the kitchen, you bought a truck. You found what your father spent his whole life hiding, and you handled it like someone who has been handling things her whole life. A pause. Because you have been. She did not say anything for a moment. Outside, the Tennessee night was still. No wind. Just the sound the farm made when it was at rest. The hearing is January 8th, she said. I'll drive you, he said. You don't have to, I'll drive you, he said again. Not as an offer. As a statement of fact. She looked at the kitchen. At the clean counters and the organized box and the window that looked out at the dark where the barn was. All right, she said. Thank you, Hank. Get some sleep, he said. You've got a lot of work to do. She set down the phone and stood in the kitchen for a minute longer. The overhead light was warm, and the house smelled like the beans she'd made for dinner, and the faint cedar of the porch lumber that still hadn't quite settled into its surroundings yet. She was not afraid. She was something else. Something she had felt before, at the beginning of difficult shifts, when she had known the night was going to be hard, but she also knew she had done this before, and she would do it again. The steadiness that comes not from certainty about the outcome, but from certainty about yourself. She turned off the kitchen light. She picked up her father's ruler from the counter where she had set it down. She carried it to the bedroom and set it on the nightstand the way she had every night since she got here. She lay down in the dark. The house settled around her. Something in the walls shifted. The furnace clicked on. 3 weeks. She had 3 weeks to walk into a county courthouse and show a judge every single thing she had done since October. And she had receipts for all of it. And she had Dot Greer's testimony. And she had Owen Fitch. And she had a box on her kitchen table that told the story of a 60-year-old woman who had arrived at a ruined farm with $61 and had made it into something. She closed her eyes. She thought about her father in this house. In this room, lying in this same dark, carrying the weight of a night in 1969 that he had misunderstood for 30 years, believing he had done something that could not be undone, never knowing that Earl Danton had bought a bus ticket and left. What would he have done differently, if he had known? She didn't know the answer to that. She suspected he would have done much the same things. Still built the vault, still sealed it, still lived small and careful. Because Walter Cobb was a man who protected the people he loved by keeping things hidden, and that was the only way he knew how to love. But he might have been less afraid. He might have been less afraid. She held on to that thought and let it carry her down toward sleep. And the last thing she was aware of before she went under was the particular silence of a farm at night in December, when the frost is coming and the ground is getting ready to hold whatever is buried in it through the cold. 3 weeks is a long time when you know what's coming, and not long enough. Eleanor spent the first week doing what she had always done when something large and frightening was moving toward her. She worked. She painted the 4th side of the house. She repaired the fence along the east field with Hank, the two of them working in the cold without much conversation. Just the sound of the staple gun and the wire pulling tight and their breath making small clouds in the December air. She organized the document box 3 more times, not because it needed reorganizing, but because the act of holding the papers and putting them back in order gave her something to do with her hands when her mind started running ahead of her. She was not afraid, she told herself. Mostly she believed it. The thing about nursing was that it trained you for a specific kind of steadiness, not the absence of fear. Fear was always there, in the background, the way traffic noise is always there in a city. You just learned to work around it. You learned to do the next necessary thing while the fear ran its course in the background. And eventually the work took over and the fear got quieter. Eleanor had been doing this for 30 years. She was doing it now. She called her doctor in Columbus on the Monday of the second week. Dr. Patricia Hensley, who had been Eleanor's physician for 16 years, and who listened to the situation with the particular economy of a woman who did not waste time on reactions. When Eleanor finished explaining, Dr. Hensley said she could have a written cognitive assessment and a professional statement ready within 4 days. And she did not say anything about the situation being outrageous or unfair, which Eleanor appreciated more than she could have explained. She drove to Columbus on the Wednesday, had the assessment, drove back. The assessment took 3 hours. It covered memory, reasoning, problem solving, emotional regulation, orientation, executive function. At the end, Dr. Hensley sat across from Eleanor in the examination room and said, "You scored in the top 15% for your age group on every measure. I'll have the statement to Owen by Friday." Eleanor said, "Thank you." Dr. Hensley said, "Eleanor, you know what I'm going to put in this letter?" "I have an idea," Eleanor said. "I'm going to say that in 30 years of medicine, I have rarely seen a patient handle a major life crisis with more practical clarity than you have handled this one." She paused. Whoever filed that petition has no idea who they're dealing with. Eleanor drove back to Tennessee. It was dark by the time she crossed the state line. The hills were black shapes against a sky that had gone the deep purple of winter evenings, and she drove treat them with kindness, and she drove through them with the radio off and thought about her mother's quilt in the bedroom closet, and her father's letter in the document box, and the 4 numbers on the back of a folding ruler that had been waiting 30 years to do their job. She thought about Gerald, too. She could not help it. Gerald had been a good man who had made a frightened decision at the end of his life and handed the consequences to her without meaning to. She had been angry about that in the shelter, in the first weeks at the farm. She was less angry now. Not because she had forgiven it exactly, but because she understood it better. Gerald had been 62 and dying, and he had trusted the wrong person. That was a human thing to do. She had done human things too. She would probably do more of them before she was done. The farm was dark when she pulled in. She sat in the truck for a moment and looked at the house. White walls in the headlight beams, new porch, the upstairs window catching a piece of moonlight. It looked like a home, her father's home, her home. She went inside and made tea and sat at the table with the document box and did not open it. She just sat with it. Let the night be quiet around her. She was ready, or as ready as she was going to be. The second week she met with Owen 4 more times. He walked her through the hearing process. The judge, a woman named Rebecca Aldine, who had been on the county bench for 11 years. Douglas's attorney, a man named Philip Carey out of Nashville, sharp suit and sharper instincts, the kind of attorney you hired when you expected a fight. Owen had worked opposite Carey once before. He described him as someone who built his cases out of implication rather than evidence, who was skilled at making reasonable things look unreasonable and vice versa. "He's going to make your relocation look erratic," Owen said. "He's going to make the income look suspicious. He's going to suggest that a woman who left her family home in the middle of grief and moved to an abandoned property with no support system is not a woman making sound decisions." "And what am I going to do?" Eleanor said. "Tell the truth," Owen said. "All of it." She looked at him. "Including my father," she said. "Including your father," Owen said. "Because Douglas has a partial copy of that letter. Whatever fragment Ray Sutton passed to him, it's enough to make an argument. If you get in front of it, if you tell the whole story on your own terms, it becomes something different. It becomes a woman who found a complicated legacy and handled it responsibly." He paused. "But if he reveals it and you haven't mentioned it, it looks like concealment." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She thought about Walter, about what it had cost him to write that letter, to put the 1969 incident on paper. After keeping it inside for 3 decades, he had done it because he wanted Eleanor to know the truth, the whole truth, because he believed she could handle it, because he trusted her. She was going to have to trust herself the same way. "All right," she said. "All right," Owen said. The night before the hearing, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table and could not sleep and did not try. She made coffee at 11:00 and sat with it and her father's letter and went through the whole thing one more time. Not to memorize it. She had it memorized. Just to be with it. To let Walter's voice, in that careful, precise handwriting, say what it had to say one more time before she carried it into a courtroom. She thought about Earl Danton, a man she had never met, who had tried to take something that wasn't his and had been frightened badly enough to buy a bus ticket to Charlotte and never come back. She thought about Dot at the bus counter in October of 1969, watching a scared man with a big suitcase buy a one-way ticket, keeping that in her head for 55 years because nobody ever asked. People kept all kinds of things. You just had to give them a reason to let it go. She put the letter back in the box. She put the box by the door so she would not forget it in the morning. She went to bed at 1:00 and lay in the dark and thought about nothing in particular and fell asleep sometime after 2:00. Hank was at the door at 7:15 with coffee in a thermos and his good jacket on. Not fancy. Just the clean canvas one he wore to town. He looked at her and said nothing. She picked up the box and they got in his truck and drove to the county courthouse in Granger, which was the nearest town with a courthouse 40 minutes east on the highway. The courthouse was red brick, 1940s. The kind of building that had weathered a lot of county business and was not impressed by any of it. Eleanor walked up the front steps with her box, and Owen fell in beside her at the door, his own briefcase in one hand. "You ready?" Owen said. "Let's go," Eleanor said. The courtroom was on the second floor, wood-paneled walls, fluorescent lights, the particular government smell of old carpet and paper. Eleanor walked in and did not look at the left side of the room, where she could see Douglas and Sandra already seated. She walked to the right side table and set her box down and sat and folded her hands on the table in front of her. Then she looked up. Douglas was in a dark suit. He had Gerald's jaw and Eleanor's eyes, and the expression of a man who had convinced himself so thoroughly that what he was doing was right, that the conviction had become indistinguishable from his face. Sandra sat beside him, hands in her lap, looking at the table. Philip Carey was at the far end of their table. He was exactly what Owen had described. 50, gray at the temples, a suit that cost more than Eleanor's truck, a particular stillness that courtroom lawyers develop. The stillness of someone who is always listening even when they look like they're not. Judge Rebecca Aldine came in at 9:03. She was in her mid-50s, silver hair cut short. Reading glasses she wore pushed up on her head until she needed them. She sat, looked at the papers in front of her and said, "This is the matter of the petition for conservatorship of Eleanor Ruth Voss. Let's get started." Carey went first. He was good. Eleanor had to give him that. He took the facts of her situation and arranged them in an order that made a kind of sense if you accepted his framing. A 60-year-old woman. Recent bereavement. Sudden and unexplained relocation to an isolated rural property with no support network and no income. Significant and unaccounted for financial transactions beginning within weeks of arrival. Family members unable to verify the source of funds or the identities of the people who may be influencing her decisions. A professional psychiatric evaluation suggesting compromised judgment. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He just laid the pieces down, one after another, and stood back and let them sit there. Judge Aldine looked at Owen. Owen stood. He opened the box. He did not rush. He placed documents on the table in front of Eleanor as he spoke, and he spoke in the unhurried way of a man who had more material than the other side was expecting. "The trust documents," he said. "Irrevocable. Established 1989, reviewed and confirmed in good standing. The farm and all its contents belong to Eleanor Voss by direct and unambiguous legal inheritance. The cognitive assessment, administered by Dr. Patricia Hensley, Eleanor's physician of 16 years. Score in the top 15% for her age group on every measure. Professional statement attached. The financial records. Bank statements showing deposits and expenditures. Tax payment receipts, $9,400, paid within the first week of Eleanor's arrival. Repair invoices. Vehicle purchase agreement. Utility reinstatement documentation. Everything in order. Everything dated, everything traceable. The timeline. Every decision Eleanor had made since October 14th, laid out in sequence with supporting documentation behind each entry. And then Owen said, "There is one additional matter we would like to address directly, because the petitioner's counsel may raise it." Carey looked up. "The source of the funds," Owen said. "Mrs. Voss discovered an asset on the property. An asset her father left for her within the trust boundaries, which means it belongs to her under the trust terms." He paused. The asset is a collection of aged whiskey, approximately 5,000 bottles, produced between 1952 and 1969, stored under the property in conditions that have preserved them exceptionally well. Mrs. Voss has been liquidating small portions of this collection through a licensed spirits appraiser and broker. The income is legitimate. The asset belongs to her. All transactions have been conducted legally and are fully documented. The room was quiet for a moment. Judge Aldine looked at Eleanor over her reading glasses. Eleanor met her gaze. "And the nature of the original production?" Aldine said. "I assume this wasn't a licensed distillery." "It was not," Owen said. Eleanor's father, Walter Cobb, produced whiskey without a license during a period when his farm was not producing enough income to support his family. He ceased production in 1969 and sealed the collection. He is deceased. The statute of limitations on any related offense expired decades ago. There is no living defendant and no active legal matter. Carrie leaned over and said something to Douglas. Owen continued. The petitioner may also be aware of a reference in a personal letter from Walter Cobb regarding a 1969 incident with a business associate named Earl Danton. We would like to address that preemptively. He looked at Judge Aldine. We have a sworn statement from Dorothy Greer, a lifelong resident of Delwood, Tennessee, who personally witnessed Earl Danton purchasing a bus ticket and departing on the Greyhound service from Delwood on October 14, 1969. Mr. Danton left voluntarily. He was alive and unharmed when he departed. There is no police report, no missing persons filing, no record of any investigation involving Walter Cobb related to Earl Danton or any other matter. The incident referenced in Mr. Cobb's private letter appears to have been a confrontation, after which Mr. Danton chose to leave the area of his own accord. He set Dot's notarized statement on the table. Carrie looked at his notes. He looked at Douglas. Something passed between them. The look of two men who had built their case on an assumption and were now watching that assumption develop a crack. Judge Aldine took her glasses off. She looked at Carrie. Counselor, she said. You've submitted a psychiatric evaluation from Dr. Winship. Has Dr. Winship met Mrs. Voss in person? A pause. No, Your Honor, Carrie said. The evaluation was based on a remote consultation, Aldine said. She looked at the document, with the petitioner's family members. She set it down. And what medical evidence have you submitted beyond this evaluation? Another pause. Longer. At this time, Your Honor. The petitioner, Counselor, Aldine said. Carrie stopped. Let me be direct. She took off her reading glasses entirely and set them on the bench. This petition is based on the concern of adult children that their mother made an unusual financial decision following a period of loss. There is no medical evidence of incapacity. There is no evidence of exploitation. What I have before me instead is a complete financial record showing consistent and prudent decision-making. A cognitive assessment from a treating physician of 16 years showing no deficits, and documentation of a legitimate inherited asset being handled responsibly. She looked at Douglas. Mr. Voss, is there anything you wish to add that isn't already in the petition? Douglas looked like he wanted to say several things. He looked like the kind of man who had prepared for one conversation and was now standing in a different one entirely. He looked for the first time since Eleanor had sat down like her son, not like a man with a legal pad, like a 44-year-old boy who had miscalculated something important. He said, No, Your Honor. Then I'm dismissing this petition, Judge Aldine said. She picked up her pen. I'll note for the record that filing for conservatorship without supporting medical evidence is a significant step that affects the respondent's life and dignity. I'd encourage the petitioner to reflect on that before taking similar action in the future. She signed the order. Set down the pen. We're adjourned. The gavel came down. Eleanor sat still for a moment. She heard Owen exhale beside her. She heard the sound of chairs moving on the other side of the room. She looked straight ahead at the wall behind the judge's bench, at the county seal mounted there, at the fluorescent light that buzzed slightly on the left end. It was over. She put her father's papers back in the box, one at a time, carefully, in the order she had put them in the night before. She closed the lid. She picked it up and stood. Douglas was at the door when she got there, not blocking it. Standing beside it, he had sent Carrie and Sandra ahead. He was standing there alone with his hands in his jacket pockets and the expression of a man who had been rehearsing something and was no longer certain he had rehearsed the right thing. Eleanor stopped. She looked at her son. His jaw. Her eyes. The gray coming in at his temples that had not been there 4 years ago. "Did Dad know?" he said. "About any of it?" She had expected him to say something about the hearing, about the outcome, about what happened next. She had not expected that question. "No," she said. "Walter never told anyone. Not my mother, not Gerald, not me until the letter." She paused. He carried it alone his entire life. That was the only way he knew how to love people. Keep the hard parts away from them. Douglas looked at the floor, at the old courthouse carpet, worn thin down the center of the aisle. "I think I've been doing something like that," he said. "Keeping things from people," a long pause. "Just in the wrong direction." Eleanor studied him. She was looking for the thing she had been looking for since the day he sat her down at his dining room table with a legal pad. The thing she had not found. Some sign that under the management and the maneuvering and the terrible efficiency with which he had organized her out of her own life, there was still the boy she had raised. She thought she could see it now. Just barely. Like a light through a window from a long way off. "The door is open," she said. "It has always been open. You can come back, Douglas. When you're ready to come back as my son. Not as someone checking what I'm worth." He looked up at her. He did not say anything. But he did not look away either. She walked past him and out the courthouse door and down the front steps into the January cold. Hank was leaning against his truck in the parking lot, arms crossed, watching the door. When he saw her come out, he uncrossed his arm and straightened up. She walked to him and he looked at her face and said, "Well, she dismissed it," Eleanor said. Hank nodded. Once, slowly, like a man who had been told something he already knew but was glad to have confirmed. "Let's go home," he said. She almost said it wasn't home. She stopped herself. Because it was. That was the thing she had been learning since October. Home was not the house on Birchwood Drive that Douglas had signed over to himself while Gerald was still alive. Home was not the guest room with the assisted living brochures on the nightstand. Home was a 2-story farmhouse in Delwood, Tennessee, with 3 sides freshly painted and 1 side still waiting, and a porch that smelled like new cedar. Home was the barn with the steel hatch under the concrete and 5,000 bottles of her father's work standing in rows in the dark. Home was the kitchen table where she had sat with a letter and learned who Walter Cobb really was. "Yes," she said. "Let's go home." Sandra was waiting in the courthouse parking lot, standing beside her rental car with her arms wrapped around herself against the cold. She was not dressed for January in Tennessee. She never dressed for the actual weather, always the expected weather, which was a habit that went back to childhood and that Eleanor had given up mentioning. Eleanor slowed. Sandra looked at her. Her eyes were red at the edges. Not the careful performance of emotion that Eleanor had watched at Gerald's funeral. Something messier. Something real. "I didn't know he was going to do it," Sandra said. "The petition. I didn't know until the papers were already filed." "But you signed off," Eleanor said. "Yes," not looking away. Not offering an excuse. Just yes. Eleanor stood in the cold parking lot and looked at her daughter. She thought about all the things she could say. About the car. About the bank account. About 3 weeks in a guest room with assisted living brochures on the nightstand. About 4 months in shelter beds. She had a lot she could say. She did not say most of it. "You can come back too," Eleanor said finally. "When you're ready. On the same terms." Sandra nodded. She was pressing her lips together in the way she had done since she was a child when she was trying not to cry in public. "Is the farm," she started. "It's fine," Eleanor said. "I'm fine, I know." Sandra said. "That's what I should have said from the beginning, that you were fine." She paused. "I'm sorry, Mom, that's not enough. I know it's not enough. But I'm sorry." Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. Then she put her hand on Sandra's arm. Just for a second. Not a hug. Not forgiveness granted on a schedule. Just, "I see you, I'm still here. Go home," she said. "You know where I am." She walked back to Hank's truck and got in. Hank did not ask about the conversation with Sandra. He started the engine and pulled out of the lot and onto the highway heading west, and Eleanor watched the courthouse get smaller in the passenger side mirror until it disappeared behind a curve. She was quiet for most of the drive. Hank was quiet too, which was one of the things she had come to appreciate most about him. He could be quiet in a way that didn't feel like absence. He was just there, steady, taking up his proper amount of space without requiring her to fill the rest of it. Somewhere around the 20-minute mark he said, "You hungry?" "Not really," she said. "I've got soup at my place, if you want." She thought about it, about the farm, about what it would feel like to walk in the door after this morning and sit at the kitchen table alone. "All right," she said. They ate soup at his kitchen table. It was bean and ham, made from scratch, the kind that had been cooking most of the morning, based on the smell when they came in. He put bread on the table and they ate, and did not say much, and it was, Eleanor thought, the most normal she had felt in a long time. After, she sat with her hands wrapped around her coffee cup and thought about the hearing. Not about Douglas or Carrie or the judge's face when she read the petition. About Owen unfolding the documents one at a time. About the box she had built piece by piece since October, one receipt and one decision and one cold morning at a time. A woman who did not know what she was doing did not have a box like that. Walter had known that. That was why he left her the combination. Not because she was lucky. Not because she was special in the way people meant when they used the word to mean effortlessly chosen. But because she was the kind of person who, when handed a folding ruler, carried it for 19 years and figured out eventually what it was for. She had been that person her whole life. She had just spent a long time living alongside people who needed her to be something quieter. She drove back to the farm in the late afternoon. The sky had gone the flat gray of a winter evening and the road through the hills was empty in both directions. She turned up the drive and parked and sat in the truck for a moment looking at the house. Something was different. It took her a second to identify it. The fourth wall. The west side of the house that she had been meaning to paint and kept putting off because there was always something more urgent. It was painted, freshly, cleanly, the same white as the other three sides, and she could smell it faintly from the truck, that clean paint smell that she had been living with since October. She got out of the truck slowly. She walked around to the west side. The paint was dry but fresh, maybe a few hours old. A brush had been cleaned and left on the lid of the paint can, which was sitting on the grass with the lid pressed back on. A ladder was leaning against the wall, borrowed from somewhere, not one she owned. Hank. He had done it while she was at the courthouse. While she was sitting in that courtroom listening to Philip Carey describe her as a woman with compromised judgment, Hank Briley had driven to her farm with a ladder and 2 gallons of exterior white and painted her fourth wall. She stood in the cold and looked at it for a long time. She had spent 4 months watching people decide what she was worth. Douglas with his legal pad, Sandra with her folder, the shelter intake forms, the job applications that came back as silence. And somewhere in all of that, she had stopped expecting anyone to show up without being asked. You learn to stop expecting it. You learn to be self-sufficient in that particular way that was not really self-sufficiency but just the practice of needing less so you would not be disappointed. And then Hank Briley had shown up on the second day with a water valve and a thermos of coffee and had kept showing up since, without asking anything in return and without making her feel the weight of it. She went inside. She called him. The west wall, she said. Needed doing, he said. You didn't have to. I know, he said. She stood in the kitchen and looked out the window at the west side of the house where the paint was still holding the last of the light. Thank you, Hank, she said. Get some rest, he said. You had a long day. She did not get rest immediately. She sat at the kitchen table with her document box one more time and looked at everything inside it. The tax receipts, the bank statements, the cognitive assessment, statement, Owen's notes, the irrevocable trust, and underneath all of it, in the pocket at the very bottom of the box, her father's letter. She took it out. She read the last paragraph one more time. I want you to use it like you built it yourself. She had been building it since October, one cold morning at a time. But there was something else she needed to build now. Something that had been forming in the back of her mind since the morning at the grocery store 3 weeks ago, when she had been in line behind a woman she did not know who was explaining to the cashier, very quietly, that she was going to have to put some things back because she was short. And the way the cashier had looked past her while she said it, the practiced invisibility of it, and the way the woman had set aside the soup and the bread and kept the rice, because rice went furthest. Eleanor had paid for the soup and the bread, and the woman had turned around and looked at her, and Eleanor had seen, in the exact angle of her chin and the set of her shoulders, something she recognized from her own mirror. Not poverty. Not exactly. The particular posture of a woman who had been somewhere she never expected to be, and was still holding herself upright anyway. Because that was the only option that meant anything. She had thought about that woman ever since. She folded her father's letter and put it back in the box. She looked at the document box for a long time. At the shape of it. At what it represented. Everything she had documented since October. Every decision she had made carefully. And recorded precisely because she understood instinctively that at some point someone would question her right to make decisions at all. She had spent 4 months proving she was capable. And she was. But that was not the only thing the box represented. It represented what it looked like when someone had something to prove and the tools to prove it. And she thought about all the women who didn't have the tools. Who ended up in shelter beds, or their children's guest rooms, or in line at the grocery store putting back the bread. Women who had done everything right by every metric they had ever been given, and had still ended up with nothing because nobody had made sure the paperwork was in order. She knew how to read paperwork. She knew how to organize documentation. She knew how to sit across from someone with authority and explain a situation clearly. She had spent 28 years doing that in hospitals. She could do it somewhere else. She could build something. Not for herself. She already had what she needed. She could build something for the woman in the grocery store. For the women in the shelter on Mercer Street. For every 60-year-old woman who was sitting on a front step somewhere right now, holding herself together because there was nobody in the world holding it for her. Walter had built a vault under his barn to protect his daughter. He had done it quietly, alone, over decades, and the protection had held even longer than he had. Eleanor could build something too. She could build it above ground. She could build it where people could find it. The idea was not fully formed yet. It was more like a direction than a plan. But that was all right. She had learned since October that plans assembled themselves, if you kept doing the next necessary thing. She closed the document box. She stood and stretched and looked around the kitchen. At the clean counters and the old stove and the window, where the last of the winter light was going. The house was quiet around her in the way of a house that had been lived in and knew it. She went to the door and put her coat on and went outside. The night was clear, cold but still. The kind of Tennessee winter night where the stars came all the way down to the tree line, and you could see more of the sky than seemed possible. She stood on the new porch boards and looked out at the farm. The white walls on all 4 sides now, faintly luminous in the dark. The barn with its new lock, the hatch inside sealed and covered. The east field stretching flat and frost-edged to the tree line. She reached into her coat pocket and took out her father's ruler. She turned it in her hands. The brass fittings cool, the wood worn smooth in the places he had touched every day for decades. The 4 numbers on the back that had been a combination all along. Find the hollow places first. That's where everything important is hiding. She closed her hand around it and stood there in the cold for a while. Not thinking anything in particular. Just being here, on this land, in this air. Inside the decision she had made in October, when she picked up her suitcase and got on a bus with $61 because there was nowhere else to go, which had turned out to be the best decision she had made in years. She put the ruler back in her pocket and went inside. She made tea. She sat at the table. She got a piece of paper and a pen from the kitchen drawer and she wrote at the top of the page, "What do they need?" And she started writing. The piece of paper was still on the kitchen table when Eleanor woke up the next morning. 3 pages. Written the night before in the particular urgency of someone trying to catch a thought before it got away. She made coffee and sat down and read them in the early light. Lists. Questions. Half-formed sentences that stopped in the middle. What do they need? Legal help they cannot afford. Someone who knows what irrevocable trust means and can say it plainly. Someone who can sit across from a county clerk without being afraid of the room. She read it twice. Then she made a second cup and kept writing. January moved through Delwood the way it always did in that part of Tennessee. Cold mornings. Occasionally almost warm by afternoon. Cold again before you expected it. Eleanor worked on the farm in the parts of the day that allowed it and worked at the kitchen table in the parts that didn't. The document box had been joined by a second box, then a third. These were not financial records. These were notes, research, printouts from the library computer, information about legal aid organizations, what it took to establish a nonprofit in Tennessee, What services were most needed by women over 50 who had lost housing or income or both? She called Dr. Hensley and asked what she knew about social services networks in rural counties. Dr. Hensley gave her 3 names without hesitating. She called Owen and asked about the legal structure for a non-profit. Owen said he had helped establish 2 of them and could walk her through it. Then he said very carefully that he had been waiting for Eleanor to ask him to do something like this since approximately the 3rd time she had sat across from him in his office. She called Dennis Pratt and told him she wanted to accelerate the liquidation schedule. Not drastically. She did not want to flood the market, but she wanted more working capital in the next 6 months than they had originally discussed. Pratt said he could manage that. He had 4 collectors asking about access to the 1,955 and 1,956 vintages and had been holding them off pending her direction. Release them, Eleanor said. Same terms as before. She also asked Owen about Ray Sutton, whether the man had any legal standing regarding the property, any claim she needed to know about. Owen made a call and came back 2 days later with an answer. Ray had withdrawn any interest in the property the day after the hearing. Quietly, without explanation, through his own attorney. Owen suspected Ray had learned enough about Earl Danton's history with Walter to understand that pursuing the land would surface a family story he had no interest in making public. Some men, Owen said, know when to leave a thing alone. Eleanor thanked him and did not think about Ray Sutton again. The sale went through in 2 tranches across February. The first tranche, 80 bottles from the 1,955 vintage, brought $230,000. The second 70 bottles from 1,956 brought $210,000 more. Eleanor sat with those numbers the way she had sat with every large number since October. Not with excitement exactly. With the steadiness of a woman who had learned that money was not the point, and also that pretending money was not useful would be foolish. It was useful. It was going to let her build something. She drove into Delwood one morning in the 2nd week of February and parked in front of the building on the main street that had been empty for 3 years. A pharmacy once, then a tax office, then nothing. The front windows were filled with dust. The sign brackets were bare. A padlock on the door newer than the building by 20 years. She stood on the sidewalk and looked at it. 1,200 square feet approximately. Ground floor. Good light from the south-facing windows. A back room for an office. A bathroom. A small kitchen area from whoever had leased it last. She went to find the owner. His name was Gil Prentice. He ran the hardware store and owned 4 properties on the main street, and when Eleanor explained what she wanted the building for, he sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. You want to put a help center in there, he said. I do, she said, for women. For women who need legal and housing assistance. Older women, mostly. The kind who fall through the cracks because they're not young enough for certain programs and not old enough for others. Gil looked at the ceiling, then back at Eleanor. My mother lost her house at 72, he said. My sisters and I had to piece things together from 4 different directions. Would have been nice if there was somewhere to call. He opened his desk drawer and took out a key. Month to start. We'll formalize it when you're ready. She took the key. She stood in the empty building that afternoon with thin February light coming through dusty windows and her breath making small clouds in the cold air. The floor was worn linoleum that had been there since 1975. The walls were a yellow that had been optimistic once and had given up. The back room smelled like old paper. She could work with this. Hank came the next morning with a truck bed full of lumber and a list he had made himself, unprompted, of what needed doing and in what order. Eleanor looked at the list. You drew up a renovation plan, she said. You were going to need one, he said. She looked at him, at the canvas jacket, at the hands that had been building things in this county for 40 years. Hank, she said. Don't thank me yet, he said. The floor is going to be a problem. They worked on the building for 3 weeks. Hank replaced the floor. Eleanor painted the walls, a clean off-white that made the south windows look larger. A man from the County Electric Cooperative rewired the ceiling fixtures. The bathroom got new fixtures, second-hand but solid, from the salvage place in Granger that Hank knew about. A woman from the church Eleanor had started attending occasionally, whose name was Ruth and who had strong opinions about furniture, appeared one Saturday with a truck containing 2 desks, 4 chairs, a bookshelf, and a lamp. She said she had heard what Eleanor was building and wanted to contribute. Eleanor accepted without ceremony, because that was the other thing she was learning. You had to let people give. You had to stop treating generosity like a transaction that needed balancing. Walter had spent his life giving in secret because he was afraid of what happened when you gave in the open. Eleanor was trying to do it differently. She filed the non-profit paperwork with the state of Tennessee on the 1st of March. Owen walked her through every page. The organization's name was Cobb House, named for her father, named for the man who had dug a room under his barn with his own hands to protect the person he loved most. Eleanor did not explain the name to anyone who didn't ask. To the people who asked, she said it was her father's name and she wanted to remember him. That was true enough. The mission statement was Owen's language, tightened by Eleanor until it said exactly what she meant. Practical legal and housing assistance for women over 50 facing housing instability or financial exploitation in Harlan County and the surrounding region. She hired a retired attorney named Carolyn Marsh, who had spent 30 years in family law and had relocated to Delwood 6 years ago, and who, when Eleanor called her, said she had been looking for something like this without knowing it. She hired a social services coordinator named Beverly Pruitt, who had worked for the county 15 years and knew every form and every department and every name on every door in the regional system. And she called Francis at the library, who had given her a computer terminal for 4 hours on a Tuesday in November without asking a single question, and offered her a part-time advisory role. Francis said yes before Eleanor finished the sentence. They opened on a Thursday in late March. No ribbon, no press release. Just a sign in the window, simple block letters, Cobb House, and a hand-lettered note below it. Walk-ins welcome, no appointment needed, no cost. Eleanor arrived at 7:30 to make coffee. Beverly arrived at 8. Carolyn at 8:15. They arranged their desks and put out the pamphlets they had assembled, and by 9 o'clock, when Eleanor unlocked the front door, 2 women were already waiting on the sidewalk. The first woman was 67. Her name was Patsy. Her husband had died 8 months ago, and her stepchildren had contested the will, and her bank account had been frozen pending a probate dispute that nobody had explained to her clearly. She had been sleeping in her car for 6 weeks. She had heard about Cobb House from Dot Greer, who had mentioned it to 3 people, each of whom had mentioned it to 3 more. Eleanor sat with Patsy for 45 minutes. She listened to everything. She asked questions that were specific and not condescending. She took notes on a legal pad. Then she walked Patsy to Carolyn's office and made the introduction and went back to her own desk and looked at the notepad. Walk-ins welcome. By the end of the first day, they had seen 9 women. By the end of the first week, 31. By the end of April, Carolyn had taken on a second attorney, a young woman who had spent her first year at a firm in Nashville and discovered it was not for her. Beverly extended her hours. Sandra, who had started coming down on weekends in February, took over Saturday intake with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had been waiting her whole life for something she was actually good at. One case stayed with Eleanor, a 63-year-old woman named Irene, who had come from 2 counties over because someone at her church had heard about Cobb House from someone who had heard it from Dot. Irene had been told by her son-in-law that the house she had lived in for 30 years was in his name now, signed over by her daughter 5 years ago without Irene's knowledge. Carolyn spent 2 hours with her and came out of the back office with the expression of a lawyer who had found something. The signature on the transfer document is not Irene's, Carolyn said quietly to Eleanor. It's close, but it's not hers. Eleanor looked at the closed door. What do we need, she said. A handwriting expert and a county court filing, Carolyn said. I know someone for the first part. Do it, Eleanor said. Irene got her house back in June. Eleanor did not make a large thing of it. She called Irene and told her, and listened to the silence on the other end of the line, the particular silence of a woman who had been holding her breath for 7 months and had just been told she could exhale. Then she put the phone down and went back to the next file. This was the work, not the whiskey, not the money, not the legal victory in January that had made all of it possible. The work was this: a woman who had been sleeping in her car, a woman whose house had been stolen from under her, a woman who showed up on a sidewalk at 9 in the morning because someone at a grocery store had mentioned a place where people listened. Eleanor understood all of those women. She had been on that sidewalk. She had sat in that car, not literally, but close enough that the difference didn't matter. And she had been lucky in a way most of them were not. She had a father who had buried something for her. She had a neighbor who showed up with a thermos and asked nothing in return. She had Owen Fitch and Dot Greer and a combination scratched into the back of a wooden ruler. Most women didn't have any of that. Cobb House was her way of trying to give them something equivalent. Not the money. You couldn't give everyone a vault under their barn. But the other things. The legal knowledge. The paperwork. The person who sat across from you and took notes and did not look past you while you explained what had happened to your life. Douglas came in May. She did not know he was coming. She was at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning with the quarterly report for Cobb House's board spread in front of her. A 3-person board, consisting of Owen, Carolyn, and a woman from the county, Eleanor, had met through Beverly. She heard a truck on the drive, not Hank's truck, and looked up. A rental. Tennessee plates. Douglas getting out slowly, the way a man gets out of a car when he has been driving for a long time and has been thinking the whole way, and has arrived somewhere. He is not entirely sure he should have come. Eleanor had not expected him. She had told him the door was open and she had meant it, but meaning it and expecting it to happen are different things. She had thought it might take a year, maybe longer. Douglas was not a man who moved toward difficult things quickly, and yet here he was. She put down her pen. She went to the door and opened it before he reached the porch. He looked older than the courthouse hallway in January. 4 months. He had Gerald's jaw and her eyes and more gray at his temples than she remembered. He was wearing a jacket she did not recognize, which meant he had bought it recently, which meant something she could not quite name. He stood at the bottom of the porch steps with his hands in his jacket pockets. "I should have called," he said. "You're here," she said. "Come in." She made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at the quarterly report the way he looked at all documents, with focused attention that read the gaps as much as the words. He turned one page, looked at the case numbers, the mission statement, the list of services. "You built this," he said. "Not a question, I did," she said. He set the page down. "Sandra told me." He paused. "She's been coming down." "She has, she's good at it." He wrapped his hands around the mug. He had Gerald's hands. She had always thought that. Broad across the palm. The kind of hands that looked like they should do physical work even when they spent their days on paperwork. "I've been trying to figure out how to do this," he said. "Since January. I've been running through it in my head and I can't find the right version." "There isn't a right version," she said. "There's just this one." He looked at the table. "The agency is struggling," he said. It came out differently than she expected. Not the careful framing of a man managing a narrative. Just a fact. Stated plainly, like something that had been held too long and needed putting down. 2 deals fell through in the fall. "I've been covering it out of savings. Heather and I have been." He stopped. "I haven't told anyone." "I know," Eleanor said. He looked up at her. "You knew?" "I know you," she said. "You don't say something's fine unless it isn't." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a bird was working at something in the kitchen garden. The morning was still and warm, the kind of May morning that made Tennessee feel like it was apologizing for January. "I thought," Douglas said, then he stopped. Started again. "When Dad got sick. I thought if I handled everything, if I got everything organized and put in the right places, then it wouldn't be as bad. If the assets were protected and the house was secured and you were somewhere that people could look after you then." He stopped again. "I thought I was solving something." "I know you did," she said. "I wasn't." "No," she said, "you weren't." He put his hands flat on the table. Gerald's hands, pressing down on her kitchen table, on the table that had been her father's table, in the kitchen that had been her father's kitchen, on the farm that had been sitting in her name since 1989, waiting for exactly this. "I'm sorry, Mom." She looked at her son. 44 years. She had held him in a hospital room when he was 8 hours old, and she had watched him become the kind of man who solved problems by controlling them, and she had never quite figured out how to reach the part of him that was still that 8-hour-old boy. She thought maybe she could see it now. Right there at the surface, just barely. But there. "You can come back, Douglas," she said. "You don't have to have the right version. You just have to show up like a son." "What does that look like?" he said. "Like this," she said. "You sit down, you drink your coffee. You tell me what's actually going on." He almost smiled. "Almost, that's it?" "That's enough," she said. "To start." So he stayed. He helped her pull weeds in the kitchen garden after the coffee, which was not something she had asked him to do. He did it without being told, the way Hank did things, which was not a comparison she would have made 4 months ago, but which felt accurate now. In the early afternoon, Hank came by, not knowing Douglas was there, and walked into the kitchen and saw him, and there was a moment. The moment of two men sizing each other up across a kitchen. Hank stuck out his hand. "Hank Briley," he said. Douglas shook it. "Douglas Voss." "I know who you are," Hank said. "Not hostile. Not warm either. Just accurate." The statement of a man who had painted someone's fourth wall while her son was trying to take her farm. Then Hank pulled out a chair and sat down. "You want coffee?" he said, and Douglas said, "Sure." And Eleanor turned back to the stove and exhaled very quietly in a way she hoped neither of them heard. She had not expected that either. The two of them at her kitchen table. She stood at the stove and thought about all the ways this could have gone differently. All the ways it nearly did. The Greyhound bus in October. The shelter step. The $61. The petition. The hearing room and Philip Carey laying his pieces down one at a time, and the judge saying, "I'm going to be direct." All of that had happened. It was real. It sat in the document box on the shelf, in the spare room, and it would always be there. She was not going to pretend it had not happened. But she was also not going to let it be the only thing that was true about her family. Forgiveness was not pretending. She had learned that. It was not starting over as if the thing had not happened. It was deciding that the thing that happened was not going to be the only thing between you. There was a difference. A real one. Douglas left in the late afternoon. He hugged her at the truck. He held on for a moment longer than she expected. She held on too. When he was gone, she stood on the porch and watched the truck go down the drive and disappear around the bend in the county road. Hank came and stood beside her. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. They stood there for a moment. The afternoon was going gold along the tops of the east fields. A hawk was making long circles over the tree line, patient and unhurried. "You all right?" Hank said. "Yes," she said, and meant it fully, not the way she had meant it in December, which was the meaning you give a word when you are holding yourself together by will. The way you mean it when the thing you have been working toward has happened. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to feel the ground under your feet again. Summer came to the farm the way Tennessee summer does, quickly and with more color than you are prepared for, as if the land has been waiting for permission. The kitchen garden Eleanor had put in along the south wall of the house was producing more tomatoes than she could use. She had started leaving bags on Dot's counter on Wednesday mornings, and Dot had started putting them in a box near the register with a handwritten sign that said "Free, take what you need," and the box was empty by noon every day without exception. The east field, which had been brown and flat and empty when Eleanor arrived in October, was now green in that deep summer way. Tall grass with wildflowers pushing up through it in colors she did not know the names of. She had not planted it. The land had done it on its own once someone started paying attention to the property lines and keeping the deer back. She walked the field in the evenings sometimes, after Cobb House closed and before supper. The kind of walk that doesn't go anywhere in particular, just moves through the air and lets the day get smaller behind you. Cobb House had helped 97 women by the 1st of August. 12 cases fully resolved. 31 ongoing. The rest in various stages of intake and referral, and the slow procedural work of untangling lives that had been tangled by people who understood paperwork and were counting on their victims not to. Sandra was there every weekend now. She had redesigned the organization's website in April, which had previously been, as Eleanor had told her, essentially a phone number with a header. The new version was clear and specific, and had a section called Your Rights that Carolyn had written and Beverly had translated into plain language, and Sandra had formatted so it could be read on a phone screen in under 3 minutes. Their inquiry volume had doubled the week after it went live. Douglas had come back twice since May. Once with Heather, who was quieter than Eleanor expected, and who walked the farm with the careful attention of a woman trying to understand something that mattered to someone she loved. Once alone, on a weekday, without calling first, which meant he had done exactly what Eleanor told him to do. Show up, like a son. They were not where they had been. Eleanor did not expect them to be. 31 years of a certain kind of relationship did not become a different kind of relationship in a few months. But it was moving. Slowly and sometimes awkwardly, The way things move when the people involved are trying honestly instead of strategically. That was enough. More than enough. It was the thing she had not been sure she would ever have again. On an evening in late August, Eleanor drove home from Cobb House later than usual. A case had run long. A 71-year-old woman named Harriet, whose property had been misclassified by the county in a way that affected her tax status and her eligibility for a state program she had been counting on. Eleanor had made 3 phone calls from her office, each one to a different department, and had identified the error and gotten a correction initiated, and had written Harriet a letter explaining what would happen next and when and who to call if it didn't. Standard work, the kind of thing she did every week now. But Harriet had held her hand on the way out and said thank you in the voice of a woman who had stopped expecting people to help and was still adjusting to the fact that sometimes they did. Eleanor drove the farm road with the windows down. August air in Tennessee has a quality in the evening, warm and thick with the smell of things growing, the kind of air that makes you aware you are breathing it. The farm appeared at the end of the drive with the porch light on, which meant Hank had come by and turned it on, which was something he had started doing when she worked late, without being asked and without mentioning it. She parked and got out and stood in the drive. She looked at the house, all 4 walls painted white, the new porch, the kitchen garden along the south wall, the barn with its new lock and its repaired east end, solid and square against the August sky. She walked to the barn. She unlocked the door and stepped inside and walked to the northeast corner and pulled back the plywood and looked at the hatch. She did not open it. She knew what was down there. She had been down 4 times in the past 6 months, each time to release a batch for sale, each time documented and managed by Pratt and overseen by Owen. More than 4,000 bottles remained on those shelves. Enough to fund Cobb House for years. Enough for whatever came after that. She crouched and put her hand flat on the steel. Walter had built this in 1952. He had dug the room by hand over 2 years. He had poured the concrete. He had built the shelves and wired the ventilation and sealed the whole thing under a barn floor and spent the rest of his life being a quiet man who liked his barn more than people understood. He had been afraid his whole life that someone would come and take what he had built. He had sealed it and locked it and never told anyone. And in the end, the danger had not come from Earl Danton or the county sheriff or any of the threats he had spent 30 years preparing for. The danger had come the way it usually came, from ordinary fear inside a family, from a son who was scared and did not know how to say so, from a daughter who signed her name to things she should not have signed because someone told her it was practical. Walter had protected Eleanor from the outside world. He had not been able to protect her from inside her own family because he did not know that was where the danger would come from. But he had given her the combination, and she had used it, not just to open the hatch, to open everything else too. She stood up. She covered the hatch with the plywood. She walked out of the barn and locked the door behind her. The evening light was doing what it does in August in that part of Tennessee, long and gold and slower than it has any right to be, holding on at the edges of things, the tree line and the rooftop and the tops of the tall grass in the east field, like the day is taking its time about leaving. She walked past the barn and across the yard and down the slope toward the creek. She could hear it from halfway across the field. Water over stones, the same sound it had made in January when it was half frozen, and the sound it had made in April when the spring melt had it running fast. Consistent, patient, moving because that was what it did, regardless of the season. She stood on the footbridge Hank had built in June. Planks laid flat across 2 joists, simple and solid, exactly what the crossing needed and nothing it didn't. She stood on it and looked at the water moving underneath. She reached into her jacket pocket. The ruler was there. It was always there now. She had stopped thinking of it as a deliberate choice to carry it. It had simply become part of what her coat pocket held, the way a key or a phone becomes part of what you reach for without thinking. She took it out and held it in both hands. The brass fittings had warmed to her temperature from her pocket. The wood was smooth in the places Walter's hands had worn it smooth over decades of daily use. She turned it over. The 4 numbers on the back, scratched in with a knife point, still legible in the low light if you knew where to look. She thought about her father standing in this same field, maybe on this same ground, looking at the barn and thinking about what was underneath it and knowing he could not say a word, carrying that alone. Every morning, Every evening. Every quiet supper at the kitchen table where Eleanor had sat across from him as a child and watched him and wondered why he seemed so far away. He had not been far away, he had been right there. He had just been holding something so heavy that there was no room left for him to be present in the ordinary way. She understood that now in a way she had not understood it in November when she first read the letter. Understanding took time. It took living with something through different seasons, seeing it in different lights, before you got the full shape of it. Walter Cobb had not been a cold man. He had been a scared one. And he had loved his daughter the only way he knew how. Quietly. Completely. By building something that would last longer than he did and leaving her the key. She had been angry at him for years without knowing she was angry. For the evenings in the barn. For the short conversations. For the distance that seemed like indifference when she was young and had taken her most of 60 years to understand was something else entirely. She was not angry anymore. She was grateful. Not for the money, though the money had made things possible. Not for the vault or the whiskey or the combination scratched into the back of a wooden ruler. She was grateful for the proof that someone had thought she was worth that. That someone had looked at her when she was too young to know she was being looked at and decided she was the one who would figure it out. She had figured it out. Not the way Walter would have predicted, maybe. He had probably imagined something quieter. Eleanor receiving her inheritance, securing her old age, living comfortably on a farm in Tennessee. He had not imagined Cobb House. He had not imagined 97 women and a corkboard covered in case notes, and Carolyn and Beverly and Francis and Sandra on Saturday mornings doing intake with the focused calm of someone who had finally found the right room. But she thought he would have approved. She thought he would have sat in the chair by the kitchen window and looked at what she had built and been quiet in the way he was always quiet, which was not absence but presence of a very particular kind, and she would have known without being told that he was glad. Hank's voice came from the direction of the porch. Not loud, not urgent, just his voice carrying across the field in the evening air. Eleanor. She looked up. He was standing on the porch steps. She could not see his face clearly from this distance, but she knew his posture. The way he stood, easy and unhurried, a man who had nowhere else to be and was not pretending otherwise. "Supper's going to get cold," he said. She looked down at the ruler in her hands, at the 4 numbers on the back, at the brass fittings and the smooth wood and the joints that still moved the way they were meant to move after decades of use. Find the hollow places first. She folded it closed. She put it back in her jacket pocket. She stepped off the footbridge onto the grass and walked back across the field toward the house. The light was going now. That fast August departure when the gold finally gives up and the blue comes in, and the farm was settling into the sounds of evening. Crickets starting up in the field grass. Something moving in the tree line. The creek behind her, constant. She walked past the kitchen garden, past the south wall of the house with its white paint and its new gutter, past the barn with its locked door and everything underneath it, past the porch steps where Hank was standing with his hand on the railing. She went up the steps, he held the door, she went inside. The kitchen smelled like whatever he had made for supper, something with onions and something warm underneath, and the overhead light was on and the table was set, and her father's chair was still positioned by the window where it had always been, where Walter had sat every evening looking at the barn, looking at the secret he was keeping, looking at the thing he had built for the daughter he did not know how to tell. She hung her jacket on the hook by the door. The ruler stayed in the pocket. It would be there tomorrow. She sat down at the table. Hank brought 2 bowls and sat across from her, and they ate without saying much, because they had learned by now that they did not need to fill the quiet between them, that the quiet was not empty, but full of something that did not need words. Outside, the August night was coming in over the Tennessee hills the way it always did. Slowly, then all at once. Stars appearing one at a time above the tree line, until there were too many to count. The kind of sky that only showed itself this clearly when you were far enough from everything else to let it. Eleanor ate her supper. She looked out the window at the dark where the barn was. She thought about Patsy and Irene and Harriet and the woman at the grocery store whose name she still did not know. She thought about Douglas pulling weeds in the kitchen garden, and Hank painting her 4th wall, and Sandra on Saturday mornings leaning forward across a desk toward a woman who needed someone to lean toward her. She thought about Walter. She thought about what it meant to leave something for someone. To build a thing in secret and bury it and trust that the right person would find it. To spend your whole life protecting something you could not explain, and to die hoping it had been enough. It had been enough. More than enough. It had been everything. She finished her supper. She put her bowl in the sink. She stood at the window for a moment and looked at the dark farm, at the shapes she knew by heart now, the barn and the tree line and the field and the creek she could not see but could imagine exactly, moving over its stones in the dark, patient and unhurried, doing what it had always done. She turned off the kitchen light. She was home.